It's difficult to really explain how much the Stamp Act was disliked in the colonies. Now, while there was a great deal of hatred for the Stamp Act, this wasn't really understood in England. The Crown and His Majesty's government did not really grasp the extent to which the colonists were angered over this act. And it was in 1765 that you get 9 of 13 colonies sending representatives to New York City to meet and to discuss the stamp tax to try and figure out what to do. It wasn't all 13 of the colonies, but it was more than half. And so you're starting to see a greater incidence where the colonies are acting collectively for the common good rather than just for the individual colony, being in all for themselves. Now, in this case, they actually went through, they drew up a list of grievances, they drew up a list of rights, all of the different complaints that they had, and this was thought to hopefully make an impact on the king. Largely, though, the Stamp Act Congress was ignored by Britain. But the big news about this was intercolonial unity. Remember, Ben Franklin had really wanted that during the French and Indian War with the Albany Congress, but it wasn't to happen because no one was willing to give up their sovereignty. Now, in this case, there is the greater likelihood of colonies being willing to give up that sovereignty. It's a step on the path to an actual colonial government representing all the colonies. Now, as a result of the Stamp Act and as a result of the desire to do something, some colonists agreed to boycott supplies. They didn't want to buy anything from England or from Britain that they could make on their own. They were trying to hurt Britain economically by making do with what they could basically create here on their own. Now, remember, we were not supposed to be any kind of manufacturing center. All of that was supposed to be coming from England. We did have that ability to make things for ourselves, but that was it. So now we're going to try and be more reliant on what we can do instead of trying to get things from England. And into this came groups of individuals that were willing to come together and take some form of direct action. They would be known as both the Sons and the Daughters of Liberty, and they took the law into their own hands. Now, you remember that picture we saw earlier, the tarring and feathering of the tax collectors. Well, now they're going to expand that. Now it's not just going to be against those who are collecting the duty on the stamp tax, but it was in fact going to be against those who had agreed to boycott the goods. People who had said they would do one thing but didn't, then they would be the target of the anger of the Sons and the Daughters of Liberty. Now, these groups didn't just go after those folks, they also stormed the houses of important officials and stole from them. They would go into customs houses, they would go into the homes of governors and things like that. They would steal what they could, they would take their money, they would try to essentially go through and make life as miserable as possible for those who were actually going through and supporting the tax or not boycotting the British goods. Now, stunned, all of a sudden, demands started to appear in Parliament for a repeal of the stamp tax. However, there were about 7.5 million Brits who were now questioning why they were paying so much in taxes to protect the colonies, but 2 million colonials refused to pay, only 1/3 of the cost of their own defense. So you're starting to see a real split, not just between the rabble rousers in the colonies and the crown, but now you're starting to see some resentment on both sides of the people. This is a point where both sides are really starting to pull apart and become much more polarized. 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but passed something called the Declaratory Act. Now, the Declaratory Act proclaimed that Parliament had the right, quote, to bind, unquote, the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever. In other words, what the Declaratory Act said was that, yes, we are repealing the Stamp Act, but we reserve the right to do this whenever we want to. So while they were caving to pressure from the colonies, they were trying to assert the fact that even though they were in this one case, it didn't mean that all was over. They were still going to be able to rule the colonies. At least that was their thought.